Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this RSA webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Meredith Doig, and I'm President of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Wherever you're joining us from, the RSA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and sea and community. So tonight, our guest speaker is someone who, I might say, has truly stood up and spoken truth to power. Collin Acton was a military Director General heading up the Navy's chaplaincy service. And during his time in the military, he realised that the chaplaincy service that he headed was not necessarily serving the needs of the men and women it was meant to help. So he set about changing that, and we'll invite him to talk about how he did that. Now, Collin and his colleague Phil will present for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll work through questions that have been sent in beforehand during registration. But remember that you can always type some more questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure that we get through those before we finish as well. I do try to keep to time, so I'll start to close this off at 8:30. And and by the way, this is being recorded. So without any further ado, Collin, over to you.
Meredith, thank you very much. And Phil, I look forward to what you have to say immediately following too. And I've got to just give the shout out to Phil. It was Phil's article in the Defence Force Journal at one of those really important pieces of thought that got me thinking that maybe things could change. So Phil, you had a big hand in it right from the get-go. There are a few things that actually got me thinking, and if I was some way down the track here and I attended a Chief of Chaplains conference. It sounds pretty weird, but it's basically the Chiefs of Chaplains from nations all around the world. Ostensibly, it's a NATO activity, but this thing occurred in Helsinki, Finland. So on top of being in a pretty cool place, Finland, I got to do a bit of running with a fellow runner who also happened to be the United States Army Chief of Chaplains. And we were chatting over a beer one evening. And he said, it's quite remarkable, Colin, when you think about it. He said, I reckon it would be almost impossible to imagine that anything like chaplaincy as it exists today would be possible if defence started over with a clean sheet of paper. And I agreed with him then, and I still think he's right. You know, when over 60% of the Australian Defence Force, or more tellingly, 80% of those new recruits joining the ADF have no religious affiliation, or to put it more bluntly, have no interest in or see any relevance in religion in their lives. Why would you have religious clergy? And that's what chaplains are. They're ordained religious clergy. Wellbeing support for the ADF workforce. So you've got 160 odd full-time Christian ministers, clergy, and another 100 part-time clergy providing this.
Did you say 160 full-time clergy?
Yep. And another 100 part-time. So it's very interesting at a time when the workforce religious stats are going in reverse. And it's also interesting when you look at the qualifications that are needed to be a religious clergyman. I've got no qualms with the qualifications. If you're going to work in a church, that's completely fine. So you're in theology, and for the vast majority of chaplains, that's Christian theology. And a lot of people in defence have no idea what that means. They assume it's got something to do with helping people. But when you have a look at theological colleges and the theological degrees they offer, you're talking about subjects like expertise in Greek and Hebrew, Old and New Testament books of the Bible, that is exegesis, understanding and being able to explain them, biblical theology, doctrine, church history, hermeneutics, homiletics, apologetics, perhaps Christian ethics. And I know a friend of mine did some ethics with chaplains about 10 years ago, and he was very surprised to learn how very little chaplains knew about ethics. And chaplains might also possibly do some Christian counselling. And I underline that word Christian because it's from the Bible. You know, what does the Bible say about human relationships? So these are the qualifications that chaplains have when they come into their military service. They're also required to be ordained by their churches and have at least 2 years church experience as a pastor, priest, or minister. Now, friends, the church is not a cross-section, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, it's not a cross-section of the general community. And I was really excited to read Neil Francis's work, and he really lifted the lid on what we already know about church attendance in this country.
Collin, could I just interrupt there because you mentioned Neil Francis's work?
Yep.
Neil is an independent social researcher.
Yep.
And the Rationalist Society commissioned him
yep.
to investigate religiosity in Australia, and that he's now written 2 reports for us, and there's a third one coming.
Oh, good.
So, which should be out before the end of this year. But if anybody listening or watching is interested in having a look or dipping into some of those reports, they are on the RSA website. And I think you'd probably agree with me, Collin, when I say that these really are landmark reports. Nobody has pulled together all this data, and it's very credible data from the ANU and elsewhere and the census.
Yep.
Nobody else has pulled together such a broad range of relevant data and analysed it as forensically as Neil really has.
No, certainly it is a landmark piece of work, and I wish it was read more widely, particularly by senior defence leaders. I think it will be really helpful. And as I say, it's lifted the lid on church attendance in this country. You know, it is quite frankly disappearing through the floor, even amongst those who define themselves as Christian. And a shrinkingly small portion of Australians attend church regularly, and younger Australians are so much less likely to attend church at all. Just making sure I say what I need to so it's written down and I can make the text available too. Yet let it sink in that the ADF's most visible and primary wellbeing practitioner is a religious clergy person with these qualifications, the degree in theology, which has so little in it that's relevant to the modern workforce, and whose church experience is with a group of fellow religionists who don't even come close to resembling the women and men who join the ADF today. So it's not difficult to agree with the former chief of chaplains to the US Army. It is indeed very unlikely that anyone could get away with assembling the current religious chaplaincy model that we have today. Now, I'm pleased to say that Navy has had its light bulb moment. And it wasn't just me. I recall going for a cup of tea and a biscuit, or I thought I was going to have a cup of tea and a biscuit with the then Deputy Chief of Navy, Mick Noonan, and he sat me down. I didn't get a cup of tea or a biscuit, but he threatened to put a boot up my backside if I didn't do something about chaplaincy. And that is exactly what I wanted to hear, that we needed change. So he was my biggest supporter. He's currently Chief of Navy and has been the biggest supporter to bring about change, even with all of the resistance and all of the, the backroom deals, etc., to try and slow it down or stop it. He's been there. However, Army and Air Force appear to be resisting the need to modernise their chaplaincy model. And the 3 services have independent chaplaincy services, common training, but they are independent. And I believe it is to the detriment of Army and Air Force personnel.
Collin, sorry, can I just interrupt? There's a question which is sort of relevant to what you've just said, and that is that the quoted number of chaplains, I think it was 120 full-time and 100 part-time?
Oh, about 150, 160 full-time. Yep.
Is that for the total, the 3 services, or is that just Navy?
Yeah, I think Army have got about 75, Navy have about 35, and Air Force, never work out why the Air Force had more, but they seem to have more.
So that's 150 across the 3 services?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you trying to understand why those services don't want to bring about reform. And I was just thinking, when questioned about why the Army was not following Navy's lead on non-religious support, This is a second-hand story, but I heard that one senior star-ranked Army officer is purported to have said in defence of the current religious model, he said, think about it like this. Who do you want to bury you on the battlefield? That's the mindset that the chaplain is absolutely necessary. And there's an underlying assumption, and I think it's an assumption that needs to be challenged. It's a view that sees religion as vital, a vital support to morale on the battlefield. And it's commonly expressed as there are no atheists in foxholes. Somehow when the darkness and dread of battle descends and the level of fear increases, that people get religious. Hence the need for the padre right up there at the front line. And friends, there's a couple of problems with this view. Firstly, it's not true. There are atheists and religiously disinterested people in foxholes all around the world. And there's not one shred of evidence to support the view that combat commonly causes people to turn to God. If it were true, one would expect to see a spike in religious adherence from those who've been deployed on active service. And over the last 20 years in Australia, we've certainly had a large number of Australians who've been deployed on active service. And there has been no spike because it isn't true. The view also fails to take into account the large number of humans that go through other kinds of adversity without the need to resort to religious faith. And I think it's disrespectful to their stories of coping without religion. Look, religion is one way that people cope with adversity, but there are also other non-religious ways which do not suppose a supernatural force or power to make sense of life and suffering. And I think there's a second problem with that view that somehow religion is necessary for morale. And I think it's a much bigger problem for the current ADF leadership. If it were true that soldiers need religion on the battlefield, then why does the ADF fearful atheist dilemma? Of the 150, 160 full-time chaplains, they're overwhelmingly Christian. There's a handful, and we're talking less than 5 or 6 chaplains from other faith groups. There's a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist here and there, and a couple of Jewish chaplains. But they are predominantly Christian. So let's face it, on the battlefield, your chances of seeing anything other than a Christian padre is almost zero. Now, I understood that Australia was a pluralistic society and some of the fastest growing religions in this country are not Christian. So what role does the ADF have in choosing winners on the battlefield? Or to put it another way, what business does the ADF have in privileging the Christian faith and its ministers over all the rest? I think that's a real problem that Defence have got to come to terms with and address. And additionally, where's the diversity in this overtly Christian capability? If it's so important to give the confused atheists somewhere to turn, why not have a group of multi-faith religious leaders trained, ready to deploy, so they can actually be there at the front, so when the confused atheist turns, they've got a range of different religions to choose from, rather than just providing one Christian solution. I think the third problem with that prevailing view that religion is necessary for morale, and it revolves around that idea that soldiers need to be good under those battle conditions, combat conditions. And chaplains often push the line that religion is necessary for an ethical life, and that without faith, it's impossible to be good. Now, aside from being a freaking arrogant assertion, a number of close inspections of religious communities, particularly in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, have pretty much pulled the rug out from under that line of reasoning. The Royal Commission into Institutional Child Abuse, or there was a recent study in Sydney about family domestic violence in Anglican communities, and particularly amongst their clergy, and family domestic violence rates higher than that of the general community. There is no good reason to believe that religious faith inclines a person to act in moral ways better than a humanist or an agnostic. As one meme puts it, religion have morals. If you can't determine right from wrong, you lack empathy, not religion. So, my view is members, those most likely to use this service, are crying out for a wellbeing model that actually suits them. And no matter which way you cut it, the ADF workforce is less religious, and prior to joining the ADF, and almost vanishingly unlikely to show up on the doorstep of a minister, pastor, or any other religious professional for help when life gets difficult. That is not something young people do. Australians and this younger generation is completely comfortable to confide in friends or their GP or their family members or to seek out a counsellor or a psychologist. That's what they do. And yet when they join the ADF, they discover that the key person in their mental health and wellbeing on the ground is a religious clergy person. It just doesn't make any sense. And look, chaplaincy is a discretionary service. No one's required to go to the chaplain. You know, unlike a doctor where you need to go and get your needles or you need to have your health checked. Chaplaincy is a discretionary service. And to be effective, defence need to work really hard to make sure that there are as few barriers as possible for people to use that service. So it's completely unsurprising and completely uncontroversial to say that religion is a barrier for many people to access that care. And as members approach a chaplain and see that cross on their lapel or over their chest, they're and this is regardless of what the chaplain actually believes. The chaplain might be the most liberal person in the whole world, but the mere fact that they've got a cross on their shoulder or their chest, or should I say a crescent or some other religious symbol, most people will be reminded of the church's hang-ups and negative views around sex, same-sex marriage, divorce, abortion, and of course its institutional child abuse problem. And as having been a padre for many years, you know, I've endured all those jokes, you know, the pedophile jokes. I recall being deployed on a small boat with a guy who used to tell me these jokes about priests and little boys. And when I found out he was going to be the CO on the ship, I thought, oh no, this is going to be 6 weeks with this person who's just on my case all the time. But, you know, that's fairly common. People look at the clergy person and their first thought isn't, oh, what a wonderful human being. It's some of the terrible things that have happened. Individuals may also experience a general discomfort. You know, the clergy person is judging them and thinks that their lifestyle is sinful. They may also think that, you know, the person sitting before them, they're not whole or complete unless they convert to their religion. Now, this discomfort with religion in general and the clergy person in particular is unhelpful, and it is a serious barrier to using the service. So, you know, I pondered, why is it so difficult for some senior defence leaders to see the problem? Look, Defence is a very conservative organisation. And when you think about it, its leaders join as young men, just teenagers, and they spend their whole life in this Defence Force. And they're shaped by those experiences over a lifetime. And as Phil will tell us a little later down the track, you know, a large portion of them still see great value in pardon me, if they're not practicing religion themselves, they're certainly sympathetic with the ideals of religion, and particularly chaplains. So they're very fond of their chaplains from their early days in training. And this shapes their view of the role and place of religion and chaplaincy in the workforce. And unfortunately, their experience of religion and chaplaincy is so very different to the young men and women joining today. And there's a real gap there. And it's a gap that, you know, I just don't understand why they can't see across that gap and see a way of opening up another way of helping people or providing support to people that doesn't involve religion. Because it's interesting, when you think about capability more generally, they have no differences with other kinds of capabilities. You know, there are no mirages flying around in the skies. You know, there are no Leopard tanks. I go riding with a guy who used to drive, he was a Leopard tank commander, and we always stop at the War Memorial. We've been at the War Memorial, actually, at the Leopard tank there. And he tells me all sorts of Leopard tank stories, but we don't use Leopard tanks anymore. You know, the Charles F. Adams DDGs and the Oliver Hazard Perry FFG, they've all gone. They've been replaced by more modern and more capable platforms. But religion and religious chaplaincy continues largely untouched and unaffected by time and the trends or needs of the current workforce. And what I find really astonishing too is, you know, whenever the question comes up about, is this still relevant? You know, the workforce, you know, those most likely to access the services of a chaplain are rarely consulted to ask about their preference for the service. They'll go and talk to the DG chaps and say, what do you think? And unsurprisingly, we just have the status quo in Air Force and Army. Additionally, I just want to focus a little on a committee that Defence employ. And it's a committee that makes reforming the capability very difficult. So Defence actually, the Minister appoints and Defence employ a Defence committee called the Religious Advisory Committee to the Services, RACS. It's a committee, bishops or religious group equivalents, appointed by the Minister and funded by Defence. And it's a committee who individually appoint and endorse religious clergy to be Defence chaplains. And it's a committee that also believe they have some sort of duty of oversight towards ADF chaplaincy. And it's a committee with some odd views of the world, and views, I think, that are odds with ADF values. And one example might highlight the problem, and that is the Anglican member of the RACS committee is reported to have said in an Anglican publication shortly after taking over his role in 2020 that he wants to encourage chaplains to make disciples who make other disciples. If you have a look at the Anglican Defence website, Defence Anglicans website, it says that our heart is to minister in the Australian Defence Force, to be ambassadors for Christ and to represent the Anglican Church in this complex secular context. We do this in Jesus' name. So making disciples, representing Jesus in a complex secular context, I guess that's one take on wellbeing services, but I actually don't think it's a take on wellbeing services that most ADF members would feel comfortable with. And this is a committee that has direct access to the Chief of Defence Force and to the Minister. So, you know, I ran foul of them on a number of occasions, and they basically stopped Navy progressing its reform on more than one occasion. So if we're going to have reform, I believe it's got to be led by a senior, neutral, wellbeing, capability-focused person who's not personally enmeshed in the religious mission of chaplains or the church. It's got to be based on best practice and insights from human services and mental health research. And it should be human-centred, it should be trauma-informed, and it should be accessible to everyone. And to make sure it's accessible to everyone, you know, the practitioners like chaplains must wear the same uniform, work alongside, and deploy with the service personnel they care for. They need to be seen as one of us rather than some outsider group, like every other service is currently viewed. Now, I currently work for the Defence Member and Families Support organisation, and we are viewed as outsiders. So they'll use us, but we're not one of them. Whereas a chaplain wears a uniform and, you know, is immediately identified as an in-group person. It's also a very small number of people in this organisation. I think there's about 5 chaplains, probably one person providing social worker support from this organisation. So it's tremendously skewed. Not only are they seen as outsiders, not wearing uniform, but they're tiny, a tiny little resource. It's got to be genuinely secular. And I'm not against religion. I'm really not. But, you know, it's interesting. You know, one often hears it said, sometimes from chaplains themselves. In fact, I've said it myself. I've also said it when I'm encouraging people to reach out to their padre in the unit, because often that's the only person available on a weekend for them to reach out to. But they... And whether true or not, this describes their benefit precisely to do not resemble an ordained minister. I mean, that's crazy when you think about it, isn't it? So I think human service qualifications and experience have got to be the gateway to this capability. So I'm not really a fan. I know the Canadians have just appointed their first humanist chaplain, and the Dutch have a humanist chaplaincy. You know, I think we just need to get rid of that model completely and just have a set of qualifications that you need to have, rather than one's religious faith group affiliation or endorsement. You know, when you go to the GP, I don't think or the dentist or the psychologist or whatever, I don't think I've ever sat down and thought, I hope it's an Anglican or a Buddhist or a Hindu or Muslim or an atheist. Yeah, I just want to know that this person, and I want to be reassured this person has the appropriate education, training, skills and experience to provide the appropriate wellbeing support. It's got to be true for the wellbeing practitioner too. So you have this basic level of qualification, skill, experience, and providing the person can meet that, they're a wellbeing practitioner. And that last point is really important. So we're about to get hammered here by the Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide. And one of the big things they're sort of, clamping down on is the qualification, the skills and experience of practitioners in defence. All the practitioners except chaplains. Interesting. And lastly, I think...
How did that come about? Except
I just don't know, because chaplains are seen as this nice chap off to the side, don't keep records. There's a whole lot of issues there that I think need to be addressed. And I know, look, I personally put in a submission, I know Phil has as well, but it does need to be looked at. And I think, particularly in your wellbeing practitioners in defence, there's got to be this base level qualification. And you know what? As far as theology and what's required to run a church, there is no Australian standard. There is no, if you employ a religious minister or a clergy person, they're all at this standard for counselling or for ethics or for, that doesn't exist. It's up to each individual church to work out what they want. If they want this, then that's what you get. So it is highly variable. Having said that, there's some extraordinary chaplains out there. They're great people and they've got great qualifications and they provide good support. But again, not everybody wants their support, unfortunately. And I guess I'm getting to the end of my presentation here, and that is, I think the term chaplain itself has baggage. I know I was tremendously disappointed when RACS got to CDF and stopped us from using the word chaplain, because churches were very offended that we might use a non-religious chaplain in defence. But at one level, trying to find a word that described chaplain that wasn't chaplain, it's actually very difficult. And, we came up with the word in Navy, Maritime Spiritual Wellbeing Officer, and every time I hear that, I just want to throw up. I just think it's such a stupid term, but it had to have spirituality in there because I had to bring a group of chaplains along with me. So go figure, that word, the term for Maritime Spiritual Wellbeing Officer was designed to keep a group of chaplains happy, not to look after the wellbeing of our workforce. Again, that's another example of, where we need to go. But, I think the primary aim of this capability is wellbeing support. So why not call the capability of the wellbeing support branch? And why not call the operators in the branch wellbeing support officers? I like the term WASO as a, sort of an easy to use, just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And it's a personal view here too, but the branch has got to be led by a general service senior officer. One who is not a chaplain, and I thought social workers would be the ideal people to be wellbeing support officers, but it shouldn't be led by a social worker either. Don't have a social worker or a chaplain or any other practitioner running the branch. We actually need someone who doesn't have any skin in the game to manage this wellbeing support officer capability with a smaller number of specialist religious chaplains. So I'm not against employing chaplains. I think a smaller number of specialist chaplains is still important for defence. For some people, that's still important that there are religious chaplains there, and they should be supported, particularly when on operation. And as we reach out into the Indo-Pacific, we discover that Indonesia, Southwest Pacific, they're still very religious nations. And that's a bit of an edge that we have as we reach out to those nations that China can't do at this stage. They don't have religious chaplains. So having that as part of our, the overall strategic picture, not just to support our people, but to assist us as we reach out and become good friends, better friends, good friends again with our neighbourhood. I think that makes sense. But the bulk of the capabilities that will evolve in service qualifications at the centre of what we do. Now, I think if the ADF's to succeed in looking after the wellbeing of its workforce and break free from the anachronistic legacy chaplaincy model, and that's what it is a leftover relic from another era. Reform has got to come, I think, from outside chaplaincy itself, quite possibly even outside the ADF ecosystem. So we might need some government ministers looking in and saying, hang on a second, let's have a close look at this. But it's not impossible to reform it from the inside, and Navy has shown that it can be done. But, that recent little innovation by Navy chaplaincy to include theology in the qualifications for a non-religious caregiver, I don't think chaplains can be left in charge of it. you know, because they have so much skin in the game. You know, religion is so important to them, and I get it. It's so important. And they want to make sure that the EMSPO has got faith-based people, because for some reason they believe that only faith-based people can really look after people.
They're wanting to protect bums on seats.
It's the mission. So, you know what, there's this cosmic battle ongoing, and, you know, what we're doing in Navy is taking small numbers of bums off seats, taking them off the mission field. And as I say, you know, it was never intended to be an attack on religious faith, and I'm not attacking on religious faith. You know, for those who see it, religious faith is important, good on them, and I support their fundamental right to be supported.
And I believe, Col, you used to be a Christian yourself, is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I over about 10 years, I went from being, you know, I think a Sydney evangelical to being, you know, quite, I wouldn't say, I was angry with RACs, I was angry with chaplains, but, you know, I just grew to a position where I just saw the whole God thing as being quite irrelevant to my life and to living a good, compassionate, you know, moral life. I just don't see it as being relevant at all. But I guess I was just to finish up, but like I say, it's not an attack on religious faith. I just support those who are religious to be supported. But the majority of ADF who don't identify as religious. Now, the ADF has got to get serious about a uniform wellbeing support to those soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women. Now, their mental health and wellbeing is of fundamental importance, and they deserve a real-world chaplaincy capability shaped to their need. So that's me.
Yeah. Collin, thank you very, very much. Just before we, I ask Phil to give us a few statistics. Just one quick question. Why did Navy go ahead with this? Is there a different culture between Navy, Army and Air Force?
I think it comes down to personalities, Meredith. You know, I was ready for change. You know, I came convinced atheist, if not agnostic. So, you know, and I was convinced that, you know, I had a good friend at Fleet Headquarters who had a very difficult job there. And she knew that I wasn't particularly religious, but I had a cross on my shoulder boards. And she said, Cole, I need to speak to someone. My job is really, really difficult. So she was dealing with all sorts of difficult complaints. She didn't want to go to psychology because she felt she did that. That would end up on her psych file. She didn't want that. She felt she couldn't speak to a chaplain, even me, that she knew wasn't religious. So she paid to go outside to speak to somebody. And I thought that was really sad. I've heard so many stories like that. People who are looking for support, but just didn't, they'd be nice to the chaplain. I mean, she was nice. She would have a cup of coffee with me a couple of times a week, but she would just never sort of open up and talk about some of that troubling stuff that was difficult for her. And, you know, I heard more stories like that. And to be brutally honest, as I looked around chaplains, there weren't too many that I'd go and talk to either. So, you know, I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. And like I say, Mick Noonan, who I thought was inviting me over for a cup of tea and a biscuit, turned out not to be doing that, but giving me my marching orders unless we did something about the chaplaincy capability. So, you know, I was convinced that I had his support. And in fact, all the way through it, when it was awful, Mick Noonan would come up and put his hand on my shoulder and say that the boss and I have got your back. So I had CN and Deputy CN right behind me. Didn't make it any easier. And, you know, I'm a fearful, anxious kind of person when I feel that the world's out to get me, and I felt the world was out to get me. But it was good knowing that they had my back. The other DG chaps have got a more, you know, their leadership perhaps sees the world a little differently, more conservative, probably more religious. And, you know, that comment about no atheists in foxholes, you hear that fairly often. Rubbish.
Well, from your personal experience, let's just briefly ask Phil to give us some statistics about the big picture, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So thanks, Col. That was fascinating, and I can really hear the passion in your voice, but also the detachment, because what you're doing is sort of sitting back and saying, okay, this is my job. I recognize that what I have been leading is just not working for a whole lot of people. And so I can't just turn a blind eye to that. I've got to do something about it. Phil, give us some stats.
Thank you, Meredith, and thanks, Collin. A couple of things I should probably cover off on first up. I'm a former serving colonel in the Australian Army, but I still serve in a reserve capacity. So, of course, the usual disclaimer that everything I say here is not the views of Defence and mine only. And I think a nice little anecdote to start off with, when I first met Nicole about 5 or 6 years ago, it was shortly after I drafted or released that 2016, I think it was, article that asked a couple of questions and identified the changing demographic of the Australian Defence Force population. And I got an email or a phone call from Collin in his capacity then as Principal Chaplain of Navy, just after I'd written this article about the changing religiosity. And my first instinct was, oh, here we go. The good old Anglican chaplain come to my rescue, and he's come to save my soul. But fortunately, the conversation was almost the polar opposite to that, and led to the spiritual wellbeing officer that we sort of see today. So shout out to Cole. It was he was a bit humble in his story then, but he drove the spiritual welfare officer very much himself. So where do we get to, and what sort of drove us to this? It's useful to understand that in 2003, and I'll share my screen at this point because I think it's I think the statistics are particularly useful. I hope everybody can see it. So in 2003, only around 31% of the Australian Defence Force, the Navy, Army, Air Force, Permanent Force members had no religious affiliation recorded in the system. Now that changed early on very progressively, only at about 1% or so a year, and then really ramped up toward the latter half of the last decade to land us in 2020 at 56% of the Australian Defence Force demographic having no religious affiliation. Now, I'm sure there are some demographers or those that have looked at data in the past listening in tonight. That type of change is rapid in the demographic of the stability of the Australian Defence Force. It is not something you skip. It's not something you particularly gloss over with a great deal of thought. You have to stand up and notice these sorts of statistics. Now, there have been some very recent workforce statistics that have changed somewhat more recently, and I'll just stop sharing that screen. And if anything, there's actually increased somewhat the changing religiosity in defence. And estimates are, a little bit of workforce modelling is that right now today, we're probably sitting at about 63% of the Australian Defence Force demographic not having any religious affiliation. Now that is really quite large. Now what's driving it? What is driving it, and I don't mean to flip in and out of sharing screens, what is driving it is very much the recruiting demographic. What we see is of our very young soldiers, and excuse the codes down the bottom, the E00 to E03 sort of the private seaman and aviator role, and the O00 to O01 that you see on the bottom of the junior officers. And what we see is those people entering defence now are overwhelmingly not religious. We are talking the order of 80% of people joining the Australian Defence Force now are not religious. And as they pass through and as they get older and the more senior demographics leave the Defence Force, they will become the dominant. And in around 2030, 3/4 of the Australian Defence Force will not have any religious affiliation. And this is where we go back to Cole's point about, is the Defence Force chaplaincy model, is the wellbeing model contemporary enough to cater for a workforce demographic with 75% are not religious and don't identify with religion? There's a lot to unpack in these slides. In particular, the O07 to O010 you'll see down the bottom, they're generals. They're our 1 stars to 4 stars. And you'll note that 85% of them are religious, and in particular, and none of them are not Christian, by the way, so 85% of them are Christian. This is why gaining momentum and maintaining momentum to change Defence's wellbeing model away from being religious to a secular model is so difficult. When you have the Defence Force leadership, 85% still identify with Christianity, and indeed the senior officers themselves still identify quite heavily with Christianity. What we can't do is wait 20 or 30 years until those junior officers are senior officers and they're the next leaders, and then 80% of them are not religious, and then we get a model that supports Defence's population. That's too late. We can't wait 20, 30 years with all of the wellbeing problems we're going to have in a defence force of our size in that sort of time frame. So that's sort of the numbers behind it. There are a couple of layers. Quite obviously, young people are less religious. People that join the defence force are typically between 17 and 24 anyway, so they make up that 80%. Females, interestingly, are less religious than males. Not heaps, but certainly statistically significant. A couple of percentage points less religious than males. This is important in an organisation such as Defence that is trying to increase its diversity across the board. And if we are trying to improve the diversity of gender and increase the number of women, then it just makes a little bit of good common sense that we might provide a suitable wellbeing support service to diverse population, including the females that we're recruiting today. So there's a lot to unpack in the data. We could go line by line and religion by religion, but we of course don't have the time to do that sort of thing tonight. But the key point is 80% of people currently joining are not religious. By 2030, 3/4 of the defence population will be not religious. How do we help them? How do we provide a suitable wellbeing service to them? The religious model is clearly inappropriate. It is clearly wrong, and it may actually be doing quite the disservice to those people who require the ability to go and talk to somebody that they, as Collin mentioned earlier, that where they don't feel judged, that doesn't have the particular doctrines of their church to have to try and confront, and where they don't have to rely on the defence chaplain being able to park the religious doctrine that they're associated with. Don't get me wrong, many of them can do it, many of them do it, but it's not fair to ask an individual to trust that the chaplain can set it aside, because the perception clearly is that they cannot. So they're the numbers behind it, and of course very happy to answer any questions that flow from that.
Terrific. I've got a few questions, but I'm going to invite everybody to unmute yourselves so that if you do have questions, you can ask them. But let me kick off with a question from Julia Mizuno, who is trying to make the parallel between what's going on in the Defence Force and in schools, in state schools in particular. And she asks, Collin, do you have any advice for those of us who are trying to have religious chaplaincy in state schools replaced with a secular program of support that hires people on merit rather than religious affiliation? Do you have any advice, or do you have any experience with chaplains in schools?
Not really, but I think the recent announcement by Jason Clare is very positive. And I note that he's going to work with governments over the remainder of this year to work out the details. And I think just need to keep pressing ahead there, that we can't continue to use outsourcing, agencies like Generate and Scripture Union to provide workers. There's no problem, I don't see, with schools hiring their own workers.
Directly.
They're hiring their own workers. And you do have the odd school that thinks having a religious chaplain is fine. Fill your boots.
Yeah.
But, it should be a fair, level playing field where schools can choose a youth worker, or instead of one psychologist, one day of a psychologist, 2 days of a psychologist, schools can actually choose their own and shape up their own support for their school community.
Yes, well, we're on to it. And the good news is that we now have a government in Canberra who at least is open to change the policy that they've announced about expanding the chaplaincy program to allow funding for non-religious people is good, but it's not enough. So we'll be asking, or we have asked them to basically look at the outsourcing model, because I think that's a real problem. Next question. Kevin Farr, who I think is with us, is a retired ex-submariner and sailor. And Kevin said that he'd be interested to see what's changed and what the outlook is. Ross Corkery was here. Les Allen, I will get to you in a sec. I can see that your hand's up. Ross Corkery asks, is there a particular subgroup that seeks support more than others? In other words, with a religious background. So do we have any statistics about who does seek support from the existing chaplaincy, or what was the existing chaplaincy service?
That's one of those issues that I mentioned at the Royal Commission about record keeping. So chaplains don't keep records, they don't keep notes of conversations.
The short answer is no, you don't have any knowledge about it.
There is a coding and reporting tool which is very, very general. And oddly enough, there's been an uptick on people seeking spiritual support. So they're doubling down on every interaction in a passageway is someone seeking spiritual support. But I think that's what we've got. We've got the old capabilities sort of trying to come to terms with its obsolescence, and it's never a pretty thing.
Les Allen, you've got your hand up for a question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks, Collin, for a very informative and interesting talk. I do have a question for Phillip. Phillip, you mentioned, I think it's for new recruits, the level of religious belief is around 2% lower for females compared with males. Is that statistically significant? And if it is, do you have any inklings for why that is the case?
So yes, it's actually around 4%, and yes, it is quite statistically significant. We have around 11,000 females currently serving the Australian Defence Force, in the order of 10, 11,000. So it's not an insignificant number, and that difference is quite large. The reason for it, I could not say. I don't know. But what you have identified, so I mentioned that 80% of recruits don't have a religious affiliation. That demographic in the Australian population is only 38% supposedly report in the national census, the last national census, of course, that they don't have a religious affiliation. So there is a big question around why is it so massive in defence and so small in the national census. The question might actually point more to inaccuracies and the bias that RSA knows too well in the way the question is asked in the national census. I don't suspect the ADF recruits anything particularly different other than the cross-section of society. So why the religiosity is so different to the national population of the same age group, I can only point to a few statistical biases in the census.
Here. There's a question from David Donaldson that he wrote in beforehand. Cole, this one's for you. What options are given for funerals in the forces?
We get an increasing number of people who want a secular celebrant. So, but they'll have the trimmings of a military funeral. There just won't be a chaplain there. So, we can accommodate that as is. But, we offer weddings too. So chaplains do weddings.
And do you have secular civil celebrants?
No. So we can provide a religious chaplain at no cost to a defence couple. But even with that, there's been, the numbers of military personnel getting married by a religious chaplain has dropped through the floor. So it's, I don't have the numbers, but I'm assuming it's somewhere similar to the 75+% of the Australian community that choose not to have a religious celebrant too. But yeah, there's a growing number of people who don't want the padre involved. Thanks very much. And that's got to be respected, and great for the chiefs of service to hear that as well.
Alison Cortis has a question about the meaning of spiritual. Alison, do you want to ask that question yourself?
Yeah, just talking about spiritual, and lots of people have different interpretations. I actually don't know what it means.
Sorry?
I actually don't know what spiritual means to me. I think it's a very different term for different people, and religious people will tend to use the word spiritual as in religious spirit, but non-religious people will use it in a non-religious.
Yep. Yes. I agree. It is a very fuzzy term, and probably 10 years ago, chaplains didn't want to go anywhere near it. They just saw it as a problem. don't want to own that term, but now they're falling over themselves to try and take possession of that word spiritual. But I would argue with a theological degree and being shaped in a particular church, you're not speaking the same language as a young person who's using the term spirituality. And with the AGZ study, that was, I think there was a university in Melbourne, ANU, and another university put out a series of articles, and I think it's somewhere around 30-odd% of young people that they surveyed didn't regard themselves as spiritual. That they saw that as a turn-off, and that was one of my problems with having Maritime Spiritual Wellbeing Officer. It was yet another barrier for people to come to the practitioner for care. We use, I think it's Pachalski, can't think of her first name, but she led, and we're talking, I think it's palliative care, and there were conferences that went for over 10 years to try and come up with a definition of the word spirituality, and it really boils down to search for meaning and purpose. So, and that kind of resonates, and I can live with that. It doesn't necessarily need to have any kind of supernatural intervention. It's about the individual search for meaning and purpose in life. Yeah.
My focus as spokesperson for Queensland Parents for Secular State Schools, the proponents of having religious instruction and religious chaplains in public schools love to say that there's the word spiritual is in the Melbourne Declaration for the curriculum. And so that, as to the curriculum that's agreed by all the states and the federal government, that's for all schools, and there's a mention of looking after the well-being of children's spiritual needs. So whenever there's questions about should we have chaplains in schools, should we have got a church entry to give religious instruction, they love to dig that out and say, well, it's in the Melbourne Declaration that we've signed up to, because it refers to the word spiritual.
Yeah. I've got no problem with those groups setting up in churches and running after school clubs. Just don't do it in school. If kids want to find out about religion and spirituality, go to church on Sunday, go to youth group on Friday night, but leave public schools alone.
Interestingly enough, Neil Francis's second report goes into this issue of religiosity versus spirituality. And interestingly enough, those people who identify with religion and are active in a religion don't necessarily say that they're spiritual. And on the other hand, people who say that they're spiritual quite often don't say that they're religious. So there's a bit of an attempt by some of the organised churches to appropriate those who say that they're spiritual, but I don't think the spiritual would necessarily agree with them. I note we're sort of coming up fast to 8:30, so we need to wrap this up. But in doing so, can I just draw everybody's attention to the fact that Phil Hoglin wrote some articles for the RSA's online magazine called Rationale, and one of them was about Anzac Day. And Anzac Day is obviously controversial in one way or another, but I just wanted to read one paragraph, and Phil, maybe just get a very quick comment by you about this paragraph. In your article, you say this: I can't quite recall the moment I distanced myself from the dawn service. It would have been at least a decade ago, but I can recall the reasons why I decided I could no longer rationalise attending what is effectively a Christian church service. On that occasion, I carefully read the lyrics to the hymns, I listened to the dedication, paid attention to the reading of the Lord's Prayer, and observed the people presiding over the ceremony. I was brutally confronted with the reality that the dawn service is unambiguously a Christian service commemorating the nation's war dead. And from that moment, the dawn service no longer commemorates Anzacs and veterans the way I would have thought appropriate, and was no longer relevant to me.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds much better than when you say it than when I wrote it, I've got to say. The Anzac Day is just one of those days that means something different to everybody. It's extremely personal. Everybody has their own reflections. For me personally, one reflection I didn't want to have on Anzac Day is to feel like I was tending a church, a Christian church service. And even today, when you look at the War Memorials website, the DVA website, the Defence websites, and look at their order of service, you'll see hymns and prayers and dedications presided over by the resident chaplain of that particular establishment, and it's a Christian service. And if you're not Christian and you don't feel that our war dead should be commemorated in a Christian sense, then the dawn service is particularly challenging.
And I think a lot of the attendees at this webinar would probably agree with you, Phil, as do I. I don't find it something that I can relate to, which is a shame, because, you know, I want to be proud of the contribution that people who've served in my military for my country, I want to be proud of what they do and I want to relate to it, but I find it very distancing. Yeah.
Agree.
Phil, thank you so much for your contributions and setting the statistical context to this issue. And Collin, hats off to you for what you've done. It would have taken a lot of courage and perseverance. Well, insight initially, but then honesty to admit that what had been for so long was no longer working, and then courage and perseverance to actually do something about it, and successfully to do something about it. So on behalf of everybody here, can we thank you for what you have done and thank both of you for your contribution tonight. I remind everybody that this has been recorded and we'll put it up on our YouTube site as soon as it's been processed, and we'll let you know when it's there. Until then, thank you very much, everybody. Don't forget, we'll have the next webinar on the 4th Wednesday of July of next month. And thanks everybody for being with us. Bye for now.